be one winner all the time, and that one winner has to do whatever is necessary to win. That's not necessarily, it's not what our Lord teaches us, for sure.
Which goes straight to the sermon today, by the way, which is, when James and John come to Jesus and said, we want you to let us sit on your right hand and on your left hand. And George makes the point, they're 2 people out of 12, by the way, and what they seem to be saying is we're better than everyone else, because they're going to be winners and they're going to be losers, and we want to win, win, win. Choose me, right? Choose me. And that gets to the heart of this as well. So Howard Watts quotes a previous writing by Vanier, which he says, speaking about his own experience, communities that start by serving the poor must gradually discover the gifts that those poor people bring. The communities start in generosity. They must grow to listen. In the end, the most important thing is not to do things for people who are poor and in distress, but to help them have confidence in themselves. He goes on to say, sometimes service organizations will grow by just giving people stuff, right? Just handouts. But he says others will grow by listening to the cry of the poor. Most of the time, this leads them to become poorer themselves so that they can be closer to poor people. So what he's getting at here is, in dealing with any underprivileged group, any minority group, we have the opportunity to either just give a handout from our largesse, or we have the opportunity to give something more of ourselves by listening and finding some solidarity there. Do you understand the difference between the two? And do you see how very, very hard that is? One of the things I've discovered in the past decade, in particular, in doing work here at Wilshire, is there's been a shift in our understanding of what the word missions means. In the old days, missions meant giving people stuff. It's what I call benevolence, right? The way we do missions is we give food to people, we give clothes to people, we give rides to people, whatever we give, right? And we're not changed in any way by it, nor are they, ultimately. One of our members is at a conference this week. She texted George and me yesterday with this quote she heard someone say, if you pull people out of the river long enough, eventually you're going to want to know who's pushing them in further upstream. If you pull people out of the river long enough, eventually you're going to want to find out who's pushing them in the river in the first place. Right? and so this is where we've grown, I think, in our understanding that we can give a handout, which is, like Thanksgiving food, this is great and it's necessary. But if that's all we do, if we don't stop to listen to why people need a Thanksgiving basket and try to do something about that, and the problem is when you try to do something about that, someone's going to say you're political, or they're going to say you're not being evangelistic, or it's very, because it's hard, right? It's a lot easier to give people something than to solve the problem of why they don't have the thing in the first place. Right?
Thanksgiving basket doesn't last all year.
Thanksgiving basket does not last all year.
You need to get involved and help the people out.
So this is part of what Howard Watts and Vanier wanted us to understand about people groups, populations such as the disabled, who we don't really want to mess with. Right? We don't, yeah, maybe we'll give some money to that, but we don't want to go do that. Right? This is hard. This is a very hard thing. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, Mike?
Mark, are you familiar with I think they still have the ministry over there at Cliff Temple,
Yeah, the well.
when they go out and bring them in for
Yeah.
services.
It is a church community for the mentally, challenged.
Don't I think they have, don't they do that on Saturdays? I think?
I'm not sure what day it is, but yeah, it's a big deal.
Actually, it's Thursday, or
Thursdays?
it was.
Oh,
And the
wow.
thing is, it's not so much the mentally challenged as the mentally ill.
The mentally ill.
Because a lot of the people over there were schizophrenic and bipolar.
Yeah.
And a lot of times they'd get off their medications and have to go back.
Yeah.
I worked there for about a year and a half.
Which is
so-
similar to what Vanier's doing. Dorothy?
The analogy of teaching children, I mean, you want to bring out their resources and enable them to be capable of doing things. And I think it would be the same with anybody with a handicap or whatever, is to help them become more independent, find ways to give them strength.
Yeah, Dorothy, I think that's exactly right. The teaching example is a great illustration of this, because, I mean, you don't just want a child to know that the answer to 2 + 2 is 4. You want them to understand why 2 + 2 is 4, right? So that they can do it themselves the next time. And yet, in other areas of life, we don't want to help people get the power to help themselves, right? Because maybe we think they can't, if you're talking about the disabled, in some ways, or maybe we just don't want them to, or maybe we don't care because it's hard, right? Other thoughts on this? Yeah.
Well, I think there's even a third level, like there's a level where people just give, and then there's a level where people really advocate for certain groups, but then there's a level that most of us don't ever reach, but where people are actually willing to give up everything and become amongst a group, like either, I know some people that actually have moved into inner city neighborhoods with their, white middle class families, but to be a part of that and join the
Yes.
neighborhood, or even like the book I sent out last week about honoring Allen when he moved into one of the arts communities, however you pronounce it,
Yeah.
and actually became a part of it. Or even some, missionaries that actually moved into the villages and lived, in the villages in tents and huts. And so that's a level that most of us don't ever reach. And that's where the true level of sacrifice comes, much more so even than being an advocate. Although someone has to be an advocate, I realize, for the voiceless, to give them a voice, but.
I think that's a fantastic one. So, entry level is you give something. Second level is you say something. Third level is you do something with your life. Right? That's it. Yes, Don.
So, coming from growing up in an SBC church, that's what you did. You gave to the cooperative, sorry. You
Oh,
get,
no,
what,
you-
like,
Cooperative program,
that's what,
yeah.
what is that,
Cooperative program.
yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you'd bring your money down and they'd light a bulb around the world at Christmas time and you
Yeah,
bet
for
your
Flying
gold
Moon.
or Annie Armstrong. That's what I grew up with.
Yeah.
Not local missions, not doing anything other than you're giving your money so someone else could do it.
And this has been a real challenge to come to this understanding that yes, we need to give our money. And yes, we need to give food, and yes, we need to give clothes. All of those things, that is true. But that's the beginning point, not the ending point to this. Kathy?
I think one of the problems is that we are afraid of these people. The ones with mental problems or.
Well, these people could be a lot of different categories, and it's all true.
And I mean, yes, right, I'd have a fear, unless I was with a group maybe, but.
Yeah.
That goes back to a couple weeks ago, we talked about how fear drives our
Fear drives.
decisions.
Yeah. Yeah.
Usually not in a good way.
Go back to those political ads that are coming. I mean,
I
yeah.
about the trash, I don't even.
Danger is coming to you. You're going to be killed if you vote for my opponent.
Things happen sometimes.
Right? Mobs of angry whatever are going to come get you. So back to this idea of gentleness and being a peacemaker. Hauerwas says of Jean that he is no less a warrior than someone who we would think of that way. He says, where I see an enemy to be defeated, he sees a wound that needs to be healed. Where I see an enemy that needs to be defeated, Jean sees a wound that needs to be healed. He says we all carry a deep wound, the wound of our loneliness, and that's why we find it hard to be alone, and we try to heal our aloneness by joining a community. But to belong for the sake of belonging cannot help but lead to disappointment. We must realize that this wound is inherent in the human condition, and that what we have to do is walk with it instead of fleeing from it. We cannot accept it until we discover that we are loved by God just as we are, and that the Holy Spirit, in a mysterious way, is living at the center of the wound. So here's a way to illustrate this, because we may have trouble seeing this in ourselves. So let's think of someone else. If you think about someone who, let's go back to Dorothy's illustration of school. What is the root problem driving an elementary school bully? Insecurity.
Yes.
Do you think that's a fair statement, Madam Counselor? Some sort of wound in that child is causing them to feel insecure and to act out most often, right? So we can see that in that situation, but think about ourselves. What is it that drives us to act the way we do that we may not be able to own up to ourselves? That may be very, and that's what John is trying to get to here, to really dig in and help us take a look at our own selves to say, what is it that motivates us that may be unknown as well? That's hard, Linda.
Do you think sometimes that the reason we don't do more is because we're so overwhelmed by how much there is to do? In today's world, with media, you just know everything that's going on all over the world, all the time. Yeah. And there are so many problems, and it's so massive that I guess it's just like, what can I do? You know.
Some of the happiest people I know are people who found one thing that they can do, and they keep doing it.
Set the rest of it aside.
Whatever that thing is, right? To acknowledge, I can't solve everything, but I can do something about this thing. This thing. Whatever it is, right? Do y'all have that experience as well? Hauerwas says, until we learn to see our enemies as wounded people who are loved by God, gentleness is not possible. Until we learn to see our enemies as wounded people who are loved by God, gentleness is not possible. As long as we see enemies as someone to be defeated, we cannot have a gentle response to that. But when we find a way to see in each person the image of God and look for the wound in that person. Now, let me say this for the 12th time. This is hard. This is really hard, and I'm not going to stand up here and say I can do this. I can pretty easily now identify wounds in people, but if I can't fix them, I want to give up on them. And I want to kick them to the curb as irreparable, right? And some people probably are irreparable because they don't want to be repaired. What's your experience with this?
Well, I'll say for the 150 millionth time that it's probably ever been said, what if the world had looked at Adolf Hitler as a wounded person and tried gentleness with him while he's gassing 6 million people?
It probably wouldn't have worked. Right?
Right.
Probably would not have worked.
Well, maybe not then, but could have 15, 20 years earlier.
Yeah, somewhere earlier.
In art school.
in art school. Yeah, and there certainly is mental illness involved in this as well, right?
I mean, isn't he a sociopath? Psychopath, sociopath?
Something like that.
Definitely a narcissist.
Yeah. And hard to heal.
I was thinking about the book that probably a lot of you have read, Same Kind of Different as Me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
that Ron Howard.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah.
his wife, how she urged him to befriend.
Yeah. Someone else on this? Yes.
Well, I sit here and think that maybe the gentleness needs to start with ourselves. That lately I have thought back on, or thinking about, okay, so what's my next thing to go do? Where do I need to go volunteer? And I've looked back and the things that have been most meaningful, where I have felt the most fulfilled by doing them, fell in my lap. But I had to take maybe a first step, not even knowing I was taking the first step.
Exactly. I think that's a beautiful, beautiful comment. Yeah. Other thoughts on this before we move on? So he gets to the point of, okay, how do we take gentleness into politics? And by this we mean politics here. He says, we live in a time when people believe they have no story except the story they chose when they thought they had no story. That's freedom in a society shaped by, and he's used the word liberal, not as liberal versus conservative, but like liberal arts. That's freedom in a society shaped by liberal political theory. If you don't believe that's true, if you just ask yourself whether you believe someone should be held responsible for a decision they made when they didn't know what they were doing. Most of us don't. This ethos of freedom is deep in our souls. We believe we should be held responsible only for the things we freely chose when we knew what we were doing. Right? And yet, the story we say about ourselves is that we are somehow self-made, all of us. Right? And we all have made these wonderful choices in life that have gotten us to the place we are. And the reality is, for many of us, that's not true. We fell into the place we are. And we've managed not to fall out of it somehow. Most of the tragedies we see and acknowledge are people who had some privilege or opportunity and lost it. Much more than to acknowledge that we could have been in the same place, right? We tell ourselves a story about ourselves that may not be true in this. Okay. No, that's not important. That's way too complicated. I'm skipping parts of this. We've talked about this before. I just want to lay this out here again. At the same time we say we want to take care of the disabled among us, we also want to eliminate them. We've talked about that a couple of times, right?
Eliminate as in heal, or eliminate as in just...
Well, both.
Push them away?
I think what they've said throughout this book is we either want to fix them or we want them to go away. And this goes a lot to the dichotomy between those who say everyone has worth and capability, but we don't ever want to be born. You know, if we believe you're going to be born with a disability of some kind, then you need to be aborted.
Mark, in
yes.
contrast to this, as I was reading this, PBS had a documentary on eugenics in the early last century, where, you know, sterilization was kind of the end
Yes.
game there.
Yeah, for this same kind of reason. Yeah. Any of y'all watch the Amazon series Man in High Castle? Anyone? Okay, this is completely off topic, but
you need to watch
it's fantastic. It imagines it's based on a Philip Dick novel. It imagines what if the Allies had not won World War II.
Right, yeah, I know about it.
Right, and America is divided with a neutral zone sort of through Colorado and Montana and part of New Mexico. The West Coast is controlled by Japan, and the center and East Coast is controlled by Germany. It's fascinating watching. Season 3 is just out, but here's the deal: in that scenario, which is really true to what Hitler was doing, children who come down with uncurable illnesses are euthanized and praised for their being. I mean, we eliminate people who are not perfect specimens, in part so they won't reproduce, and in part because we don't want to deal with them, because it takes resources away.
Well, even as not long at all ago, I was in college, but
That was recent.
recently, I worked all through college at the state school for the mentally retarded, and they, at a certain age, were all sterilized, all of the mentally retarded people. Somehow they did that, and I was never quite sure how. I mean, they somehow agreed to that was a common thing. And yes, they were profoundly retarded, and they didn't even hardly see anybody else or would have known what to do, and certainly could not have been a parent. But what an extreme thing to have as a part of their life. That was just a given.
Yes, Terry.
Well, I mean, what would you do about people who are not born with disabilities, but have an accident, or they have something that, you know, happens in life that all of a sudden they are disabled? And I think about, in applying salt, people who ride a motorcycle and who have an accident, who didn't wear that helmet, and all of a sudden they're disabled.
Yeah. In our ethos, that's freedom, right? You ought to be allowed to do that. I mean, look at how long it took the Texas legislature to pass a ban on texting while driving. And there's a story on the front page of the Dallas Morning News today about how little that law is enforced.
Yeah, it's hard to.
It was first, it's hard to enforce, I get it. Now, if they would give me a ticket writing ability, I could enforce it every day on the city streets of Dallas. I would be pulling people over left and right. Right, because I see them all the time. Carol Ann?
I was gonna say that really hit close to home, because if Neil had not been wearing a helmet, one, he would have been either dead or profoundly disabled mentally, because he struck his head on the back of the curb, but he was wearing a good helmet. He still lost his leg, but it made a huge difference. I mean, he was able to recover and live a long time. Still living, thank God. But
Yeah.
Barry Busey was on Dr. Phil. I'll be honest, I listen to Dr. Phil sometimes. And, I don't always
There's
agree
no
with
sin
him.
in that.
But he was part of the reason why they enacted the law, because he was an idiot. He did a curve at 40 miles per hour with no helmet. And he ended up with a hole this big in his brain. I mean, and he's semi-recovered, but he helped a lot.
So I wanted to connect the dots here between what Carol Ann is saying, how her life and Neil's life changed in a moment through an accident. Lynette talked about how her life changed in an instant through a diagnosis. And we live in this illusion that we control the story of our lives. It's how we survive sometimes, right? That we can, and the older I get, the more I panic that this is not true.
But what's not true?
That I can control the story of my life.
Oh, you know you can't.
Well, I know I can't, but I pretend that I can't. Right? Because, you know, when you're young and invincible,
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
right?
But you're not young anymore, so
understand, some of us respond by trying to hold on more. Some of us respond by giving up. And some of us try to find a middle way through this. And what Jean Vanier and Howard Wass are trying to say to us is, if we would stop and see ourselves in the disabled, we would have a new view of the world. We would have a new view of the gospel. We'd have a new view of what God is up to in the world. Most of us can't put ourselves there because it's too scary. We can't even visit that spot mentally because it's too scary. And yet, if we could somehow imagine the situation of someone else and put ourselves in that place, what would it do to our understanding of what God is trying to accomplish in the world? How would it change our approach to other people? How would it help us be gentle in dealing with other people? The subtitle of the book is what?
The prophetic witness.
Prophetic witness and
Witness of weakness? Is that what?
Living gently in the main title, living gently in a violent world. This is what we've been trying to get at this whole time. How do we live gently in a world that's violent? When it's not going to win you an election, it's probably not going to get you promoted, but it's going to make you a better person. Does that count for anything? Still.
Mark, that's pretty significant what you just said.
Yeah. Would you rather get ahead or be a good person?
Well, you kind of do both. I mean, every boss doesn't have to be nasty.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm skipping over more stuff here because he gets into Aristotle and all this stuff.
Let's talk about that third realm thing that we talked a little bit about. You know, it's hard. I remember growing up, we were really poor, and I'm gonna work my way up and then go back. Out of your mind? I ain't doing it. But why shouldn't I do that? I mean, that's brave. And it's hard.
Yes.
Here's Jean Vanier says, when the poor and weak are present, they prevent us from falling into the trap of power, even the power to do good, of thinking that it is we who are the good ones, who must save the Savior and his church. I take this to mean, Hauerwas says, that the politics of gentleness cannot be a triumphalistic politics. It is not for us as Christians to regret the loss of Christendom, but the loss of Christian structures and institutions makes it all the more important that the gentle care exemplified by Jesus in washing his disciples' feet, that gentleness exemplified in large as well, be unapologetically a witness to the one who would save us through a cross. If we think about really letting the message of Jesus sink in and inform us in our lives, in our politics, what do we learn from Jesus? We learn that politics isn't the answer. And I will venture to say that one of the major causes of the mess we're in America today is because the church has attempted to find a political answer to its religious problem. Yes.
So how do you protest against injustice gently?
Walk softly with your sign. Well, I think Linda's asked a wonderful question, right? And this is where the rubber meets the road for us. We understand what we need to do sometimes, but it seems too harsh to do, right? I want to differentiate between a couple of different levels of response. This very same question arose 2 weeks ago when I was speaking on this panel for transgender education, and someone asked about when and how people should stand up and speak out on this. There is a level at which someone's safety is concerned that I think is the line that has to be crossed. When gentleness may not, if it will not work, it may not be appropriate to try to be gentle, because saving the life of someone else being thrown in the river to be pushed down and rescued later, if you get to the top of the river and you figure out who's throwing people in the river, you're not just going to stand there and say, please don't throw him in the river anymore. Yeah, please, Mr. Troll, don't throw this poor deer in the river, or whatever, right? Now I'm into children's stories. You're probably going to put yourself in front of that person and say, do not throw anyone else in the river. And so I think even Jean Vanier would do the same thing in this case. Despite what, are there lesser things where we can, again, try to intervene earlier and make something, prevent something? And here's where it's really hard, because most of the time at those moments, we look around and say, it's not so bad that I need to get involved. And we lose the moment to be gentle, right? We lose that moment when we could be gentle, and we let it go down the road to the point that someone has to be harsh. I don't know if that's a good answer or not. The earlier an intervention happens, the gentler it can be. I think. Is that fair?
That's where the courage comes.
Yeah.
The impetus to be strong.
That takes courage.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, let's go back to the school bully, because that's just an easy example to get to, and accessible to all of us. When that bully gets going, if someone, a teacher, a peer, can intervene more gently at the beginning and prevent the escalation, isn't that better and more effective than waiting until that kid has pushed 3 other kids down the playground and stomped them? And then you've got to physically remove the kid, and the whole thing is escalated. But yet, most of the time, oh, boys will be boys, kids will be kids, it's a phase, it'll pass, whatever, right? And there's no attempt to say, what's bothering you today? What's happening in your home that's causing you to act out this way? Do you have enough food to eat in your house? Is anyone hurting you in your house? Because we don't want to take those kinds of intervention. All right, I feel like we've gone around the world here today. Last thoughts on this from anyone? What have you learned from this bizarre little study we've been on? It's hard. Yeah, I figured after the parables we needed something hard. I do, so next week we're going to start, church-wide, we're starting a 4-week series on generosity that was written by Jacob Topper. And it's going to be a good study. We're going to begin next week talking about a generous creation, how generosity is built into the very fabric of creation. And I'll have a handout for you for that next week. And then after that, we'll be into Advent, where we'll do something Advent-y. Yet to be figured out. I do have an idea for after Advent, though, that I want to run by you, and that is, we did all of the parables, and I got to thinking about the red letter verses in the Bible. A lot of those are parables, but some are not. What if we went through and looked at all of the red letter verses in the Bible that are not parables? Everything Jesus said that's not a parable. Think that'd be interesting?
Yes.
I've never looked at that myself.
We should all bring our red letter Bibles. I mean, like,
that would be good.
I would have to
You don't have to purchase. I have some extras I'll share.
I could bring the sword That's all I got.
Donna?
I have another suggestion.
Yes.
I love the red letter, but
Okay.
maybe on further on,
Yes.
since we've done the parables, let's study the miracles
Oh,
somewhere next year.
okay.
Since they just had the canonization of the new saints last week.
Yeah, I like this idea. That's a good idea. Thank you for that.
When isn't that the red letter revival thing? It's like in the 3rd week in November?
Yeah, in the third week of November, we're having something called the Red Letter Revival. that Tony Campola was talking about when he was here.
We're
Yeah.
gonna have to go back and go through our Bibles and find one that has.
I know, that's what I was like.
Yeah,
I
I've got several from my childhood. Yeah. Okay, well, thus ends all of this. Let's go off camera, and I promise you I'd tell you this story.